You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're tuning into one of our keynotes from Winter Institute 2020, Bookselling and Liberation, Black Bookstores in America from the 60s to the present.
My name is Janet Webster Jones. I'm the founder and chief cook and bottle washer of Source Booksellers in Detroit, Michigan. I have to say we've been in business for 30 years, and I still feel like a little child when I come here to this wonderful event. I want to first say thank you to Joy, wherever she is, and Dan, who extended to me this lovely invitation to introduce to you this stellar, and I do mean stellar, panel of notable, literary, book-minded, bibliophile activists. Nobody can fill those shoes but these people. The African diaspora in the United States of America has a long and deep practice of sharing knowledge, wisdom, and understanding through writing and reading, speaking and storytelling, rhetoric and preaching, its history and cultural experiences to all who will listen. The literary work reaches back far before the 1960s, including poets, journalists, researchers, theologians, book writers, book binders, booksellers, all dedicated to activists liberating the mind. We booksellers today stand on shoulders of so many literary visionaries dedicated to lifting the chains of oppression and at the once illegal sharing of words. This important work of education and teaching and writing and reading is our heritage, and it's been our only way to liberate. Our panel today certainly stands upon the foundation of this wonderful history that we share. Our guest panel are local Baltimoreans, I think I said that right, and the DC Washingtonians who work today, not just yesterday, but today on behalf of the enlightenment and liberation of people. First, let me introduce you to W. We don't know what that W is for. Mm-hmm. W. Paul Coates, founder and director of Black Classic Press, right here in Baltimore, Maryland. He has been serving the need to recover and republish obscure, significant works by and about people of African descent. In his early career, which really touches my heart, he served as African American Studies Reference and Acquisition Librarian at Howard University in Washington, D.C., in the Moreland Spingard Research Center. He was the Maryland State Coordinator of the Black Panther Party. He was instrumental in establishing, and I think this is so important, the Black Panther Archives at Howard University. Who knew? And what great work that is. Next we have, I'm going to mess it up. Not you. I'm going next to you. Shirikiana Gerima is an independent filmmaker and owner of Washington, D.C.'s Sankofa Video Books and Cafe. She is a graduate of Howard University and the University of California at Los Angeles. She has written and produced and directed award-winning films on topics ranging from the Pan-African idea of Kwame Nkrumah's years in Ghana, West African, to political prisoners, to the United States gentrification and displacement of people of color. Then we have Nati. I'm going not in the order that they're sitting. Nati Kamau-Nataki, who is the owner of Everyone's Place African Bookstore and Cultural Center right here in Baltimore. And I have to add this part, which is part of the store, but an early part, a wholesale distributor. Now just let that sink in. Of African books and knowledge, African American books and knowledge, and has been doing that important work for 32 years. Judy Richardson. Judy Richardson, in my mind, is an icon. She has said to me just today that everything that she's done in her life has been based on her early civil rights experience with the Southern SNCC, the Southern movement of SNCC. She is a documentary filmmaker, educator, and lifelong civil rights activist. She has authored numerous academic articles on and conducted professional development workshops for teachers on the civil rights movement. And I have to say to the side how important that is as an ongoing thing, because we know how things can be left aside as we move forward in so-called progressive ways with our young people. And she also is selected from the award-winning 14-hour PBS series, Eyes on the Prize. Remember, 14 hours in that series. She helped to open Drum and Spear Bookstore in Washington, D.C. Now, last but certainly not least is Joshua Davis, an assistant professor of United States history at the University of Baltimore, focusing on social movements, policing, capitalism, and African American history. He is the author of Head Shops to Whole Foods, The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. Mr. Davis will lead and moderate our discussion. And finally, for him, I want to say that he is currently writing a history of the relationship between police and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So without further ado, let us give a big round of applause to those who I call the East Coast Power Ranger booksellers.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, loud and clear. Okay, welcome to Baltimore. Thank you for coming here. Thanks to the ABA for setting this up and reaching out. Thank you, Janet, for the introduction. I think we're really happy to be here. It's really a tremendous lineup that I'm sitting among, and I'm going to try to speak briefly with some introductory remarks, and then we're going to transition to a conversation where we can let these pioneers take over the show. Okay, so I want to take you to the year 1968. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the history of that year, but it really was a time of global upheaval, national upheaval. It was a year in which there were uprisings going on all over the world. Paris, Mexico City, New York, Chicago. It was at the height of the war in Vietnam, and also at what was becoming a massive anti-Vietnam War movement at the time, of course. It was a year of terrible assassinations of Dr. King, of course, in April, and then Robert Kennedy in June. It was a year in which the Black Power movement, particularly the Black Panthers, had emerged onto the global consciousness. Black Panthers had been founded 2 years earlier, but I think 1968 is really the year in which they emerged to international prominence. And it was an election year in the United States, of course. I'm just setting the scene, but if you focus on October 1968, I, in my research, came across a document, a memo from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. With all of these things going on, all of this tumult and upheaval, the thing that he was concerned about in October 1968 was sending a memo out to every single FBI field office in the country. And the menace he wanted to warn them about was Black independent booksellers. It's a one-page directive that I uncovered through research with help of the National Archives. I'm going to quote a little bit from it. Hoover warned agents about so-called black extremist bookstores. He directed every office that was part of the FBI to, quote, locate and identify black extremist or African-type bookstores in your territory. Open separate, discrete investigations on them. Determine the identity of the owners. Determine the number, type, and source of books and material on sale. Determine the store's financial condition. And last but not least, determine the clientele of each store. So in the course of my research, I came across surveillance of black bookstores in at least half a dozen cities. It's probably many more than that because a lot of the FBI records are not available yet. Anyone who's living has a right to privacy, of course, and those records are not publicly available. But there was surveillance of black bookstores in Harlem, LA, Denver, Philadelphia. Just in our lineup here, I've uncovered considerable FBI records on Paul Coates and his business in Baltimore. And then in D.C., Drum and Spear had the luck of being just a couple of miles from FBI national headquarters. And there are probably thousands of pages on that store alone. The pages are still coming out. Okay, so these radical bookstores, black radical bookstores, were part of a larger movement. I wrote about it in my book called From Head Shops to Whole Foods. And we're going to be doing some signings afterwards also, Hands on the Freedom Plow. And From Head Shops to Whole Foods, I think, will be in the signing section. But these activist businesses, they emerged from social movements in the 60s and 70s. Of course, the civil rights and black power movement, also feminism, also environmentalism, the peace movement, small businesses coming out of these movements and saying we want to advance our principles, our values through small storefronts. Now, despite the tremendous legal persecution that black bookstores faced, they were booming by the end of the 1960s. At the start of the decade, across the United States, there was roughly maybe a dozen, maybe a little more, maybe about a dozen black-owned bookstores in the United States. By the end of the 1960s, that number had risen to about 50. And then by the mid-70s to about 75. These stores promoted African-American political education, knowledge of self through books, pamphlets, journals. They lured customers with some of the best-selling Black Power titles of the day, everything from the autobiography of Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, lots of chapbooks by poets like Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni. The stores, in a sense, represented a new generation of black public spaces, welcomed a wide range of customers from communities, activists, curious passersby. If you fast forward beyond the Black Power movement, which in some ways never went away, but faded in some ways through the 70s and 80s. It experienced a certain revival in the 80s, late 80s and 90s, and black bookstores did too. By the late 1990s, there were 325 black-owned bookstores in the United States. Again, that's up from 75 just a few decades earlier. But I'm sure everyone in this room knows the story of independent bookstores since, say, the last 20 years. And the combination of Barnes & Noble, of other chains, of Amazon were really a tremendous blow to black booksellers. The numbers went from around 325, around 2000, down to 54. In 2014. It's a big drop. There's similar drops, for example, if you look at the numbers for feminist bookstores, tremendous decline and tremendous damage done by chains and by other big sellers online. But as you also know, part of the story, and maybe the last half decade, maybe a little longer, is kind of a bottoming out and a revival again. And just from 2014 to 2018, the number of black-owned bookstores in the United States doubled, went from about 54 to 110. I don't know how many of you know Troy Johnson, who has a website, aalbc.com, African American Literary Book Club.com, kind of the go-to for stats and kind of up-to-date news on African American bookselling. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Briefest history. But I want to now defer to our speakers. I'm going to pose a series of questions, and they're just going to kind of go down the line, and we're going to have this conversation. Each one of them is a pioneer in their own sense, and we're going to probe that history. The first question I had, and maybe we can, I don't know, do you want to start with Shirikiana? Do you mind starting? Okay, we'll just kind of go down the line. How and why did you get into bookselling?
Well, thanks first for the panel. Thanks to ABA for having this discussion. And thanks, Josh, for writing this article. I think, first, and I'm also very honored to be on a panel with such distinguished contributors to this Black literature. First of all, Sankofa would not be in existence if it weren't for Nati, and if it weren't for Paul. Because Nati has, as he was introduced, he has this 32-year-old business in Black literature. So when Sankofa wanted to open, we didn't have any capital for books. So I think Paul probably told us about Nati. And we went to his warehouse and said, okay, we want to open a bookstore. He said, cool, take what you want now and we'll bill you. So we had a van, packed up as much as we could get in there, sold it, and paid for it later. And we kept doing that year after year after year. So without that kind of support, we would not be doing any of what we're doing now. So that was back in 1998. We purchased our building in 97 because we needed a place to make our movies and distribute our movies. My husband and I are independent filmmakers, and we somehow got the guts to think that we could buy a building. We didn't have the money to buy a building. We bought it, and we got in trouble, but we still have it. But his philosophy is don't look at numbers. So I love him. I guess there are some numbers I just didn't look at, and I'm probably still not looking at numbers because we're still here in business in 2020. And we were thinking of a place to sell our videos at the time, our films on video, and other filmmakers of color as well. And we decided, and this was also his idea, we decided to sell books there as well. And so, we thought it was just a fantastic idea to put books, good literature, and good movies together, and then to develop this audience of people who expected high things of both. Because, as you know, movies have not always, and I'm not sure they are now, been held to a very high standard of quality. Technical, yes. Content, no. Especially when it comes to Black issues and material and drama. So we said, no, let's develop this audience together. We'll show movies here. We'll sell movies here. We'll have authors come here. We'll, sell as many books as we can by people of African descent and other colors around the world. And that's what we've been trying to do since then. We have a cafe now. We named the store after Sankofa, the movie that we had produced just before then. And that's kind of that's our origin story.
I want to give thanks to everyone who is here, everyone on the panel. My wife and I, we got into bookselling when we were still students, and it was because we were standing on the backs of people like Mama Shirikiana Aina Gerima, Mama Judy Richardson, Baba Paul Coates. On the one hand, and on the second hand, we were like young students understanding our miseducation and how it's connected with our powerlessness as a people. And we thought we could change that by going on the street corners and selling books to young brothers and sisters. So that's the how and why we got into bookselling. Yeah.
So I'm going to read because I can go into TMI, so I'm going to just read some points. Okay. So when Paul, first of all, thank you so much for that really great intro. I mean, it really set the stage. There are things I don't have to say now, which is very lucky for you all. So I will start. When he talks about how did I get into book selling, the I is actually we. And the we is the folks, the organizers in SNCC, and I'll tell you in a minute what SNCC is, who had been working in the Southern Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, and who then moved to D.C., Washington, D.C., to continue that work in other ways. D.C., just to remember, in 1968, when we started the store, was still called Chocolate City because it had, 60, 70% African-American population. So all of us who started Drum and Spear saw it as just an extension of the work that we'd been doing in SNCC in the movement, in the Southern movement. Quickie description of SNCC. SNCC is the organization of young people who started in the sit-ins in 1960, and then which started in black campuses around the South, then at Mushrooms, and then they are brought together in 1960 by this incredible black female strategist, Ella Baker, and then out of that is formed SNCC. We were the only national civil rights group working in the South, out of which comes John Lewis, who was the chairman when I was there, and of course is now a congressman. Julian Bond, who was our communications director, later becomes, of course, a human rights activist and chair of the NAACP. Diane Nash, who continues the freedom rides when they were supposedly being stopped. So all of these were the SNCC people. And because we were so young, a lot of us are still kind of halfway walking and talking. And so we will now have the 60th anniversary of SNCC in D.C. And I'll tell you about that later, but it'll be in D.C. at the Omni Showroom from April 16th to the 18th. And in that will be the collaboration we've been doing with young activists since 2015 when we did a voting rights conference at Duke. So a lot of it will not just be looking back, although there will be plenty of that, but also moving forward. Okay, so that's SNCC. Now, in addition to trying to open up for SNCC, in addition to trying to open up public accommodations to black people, two main goals for us in the South during the 1960s were, one, voting rights. So how do you get black people registered to vote without getting them killed? How do you get them registered without getting them killed? And the second piece was educating for liberation. So Charlie Cobb, who some of you may know as Charles Cobb, Charles, just came out his most recent book, which I think is on UNC Press, is called, it's on self-defense in the Southern movement, and it's called This Nonviolence Will Get You Killed. And it's after a quote by the wonderful black farmer who supported us in Mississippi, Hartman Turnbow, who said, this nonviolence is okay, but this nonviolence ain't no good. It'll get you killed. And who also had 2 shotguns. But in any event, that's a whole other story. So, Charlie Cobb has done that. He's now on a Carnegie Fellowship and is doing a new book on new black leadership in the activist movement. So Charlie decides that, and he comes from a long line of educators. His Aunt Charlotte Brooks was superintendent of English for the DC public schools. And Charlie had been the one who had started the idea of freedom schools in Mississippi in 1964. So he comes back to DC. He and a number of SNCC folk, had gone to Howard University. And so he comes back. He says, we're going to do a bookstore, but we're going to site it on 14th Street, which was the lower income black community in that 14th Street corridor. Now, I'm just going to, and again, all of this has to do with continuation of what we've been doing in SNCC. There was a Washington Post article that has 2 folks on it, me, and I forget how young I was. Anyway, and it says, Ghetto Bookstop finds untapped literary mart. And it says, Charlie Cobb, a 25-year-old former field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opened the Drum and Spear bookstore June 1, this is 1968, in a burned-out shop at 2701 14th Street. Quote, one of the things this bookstore disproves is that black people don't read, because that really was one of the things we were countering. And he says, like people who come in from the bar across the street, they get the autobiography of Malcolm X because they're interested. They may struggle through it a bit, but they read it. So we were going not necessarily for what we call the Gold Coast, black folks who had money up Upper 16th Street. We were going for folks right in that corridor of 14th Street. And so they asked me to come down. I had gone back to school. I was at Columbia then. And so I come down. I put a mattress on the car. I drive down. And the first time that I see the bookstore, I'm meeting Tony Gittins. Now, Tony Gittins he becomes the first manager of our bookstore. He had just come off from being one of the two main leaders with Adrian Mance of the takeover at Howard University. And that had just happened in 68. There are many takeovers at Howard because we won't even talk about the administration. Okay. So this is the 68 takeover. And so, I'm meeting him there, and, Tony, some of you may know, he later becomes chair of the DC Commission for the Arts. And then for the last 34 years has, been the head of the DC Film Festival. But then he's just come off from the takeover. One of the things that we did, I was the first paid employee for this 14-hour series, Eyes on the Prize. So one of the things I wanted to do with the team, because it was a big team, was to talk about that takeover. So he's one of those interviewed in that 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize. Okay, so I meet him. We're still back in 1968. And it's May. And I'm going through, I get to 14th Street, and it has just been tear gassed. So I'm moving through tear gas. I get to the store, and I'm assuming, there are going to be books on the shelves. No. I get in, and there are maybe 3 or 4 shelves. Some of them have been stained, some of them haven't, but there are no books. So Tony and I then drive in the van. I drive because he didn't drive, up to Bookazine, which I understand is still a distributor. Amazing. And there was a black staff person at Bookazine in New York who was so amazed that we were doing this bookstore in D.C. He started talking about not only the titles that we had wanted to look at, but some of the other titles we didn't even know about. So we come back loaded with books in the van. And we eventually become the largest African-American bookstore in the country, mainly because of a lot of the book fairs that we do, but also because of all of the burgeoning Black Studies programs that have opened up all over a lot of the universities, who at that point don't have to buy through their own, processing departments. They can actually buy directly from us. And then we start Drum and Spear Press, which does a number of books, including Eloise Greenfield's first book. We do a weekly children's program on the popular WOLAM, which I host. And then a number of books and the activities that we do bring into the store folks who had never before thought about going into a bookstore. I then found out of that Malezo bookstore, which is in what is then called the HEW building, is now called Health and Human Services. And so that was an offshoot asked for by the Black employees at then HEW. So it becomes a whole other thing, but we're building on a lot of the other Black bookstores that existed at the time. So that's it.
Am I live? This is good. Okay. So I'm sitting here listening to Judy. And Janice, it is Baltimore, okay? And it's William, okay? So for anybody who wants to know that, it's William.
Oh, the W, yes.
The W, yeah. Look, so I have to do something, though. I know we're supposed to be talking about how we got into the pub. I've got to correct something, though. I really do. It would be wrong to sit here. There have never been 300. Troy's figures are wrong, okay? And I told Troy that. His figures are wrong. If you ever had 80 Black bookstores at any given time during that period, that would be closer to the number. If you said 100, I could live with it. 300 that he's referring to is old stores that went out, and it was an old list of bookstores. So I just want to correct that because I don't want anyone to leave here thinking, yes, the number was decimated at one point, never to that extent. So I just want to be clear on that. Paul Coates got into bookselling and coming out of the Black Panther Party. I came back to Baltimore from Oakland, disillusioned with the Black Panther Party. I still had people in jail because that was the consequence of the Black Panther Party and the long legacy. The people are still in jail. Here in Baltimore, I had people in jail. I had people under charges. And I was really lost and floundering as to what to do with them in jail and what to do with my life. I got with a couple of ex-people, ex-Panthers, ex-communists, ex-socialists, and ex-Pan-Africanists, and we got together and we tried to put together a program that we could actually do something in the community. I still was interested in one of the aspects that Judy talked about, education, and it was one of the large takeaways from the Black Panther Party. Even though that organization we put together did not work, I was able to put together a program called the George Jackson Prison Movement. And that program was built on the idea that, one, we would establish a bookstore. Two, we would establish a publishing company that would publish books for that bookstore and other Black bookstores in the country. And three, we would build a printing company that actually would print books to supply the publisher and to supply the bookstores. That was supposed to work with people coming out of the jails, staffing, and being restored in our community. That notion and the name George Jackson Prison Movement was based on the idea of George Jackson, who had recently been killed in San Quentin prison. Some of you guys may remember that. George was a model in our community and certainly in my life, and a big inspiration because he had gone into jail and literally educated himself with books. Malcolm did the same thing. And so working with people in jail, we saw that as a way of resurrecting not only those people, but as a way of liberating our community and building institutions in our community that we control. It was a no-brainer for me to do that. We just didn't have the resources to do it at the time. So the first step was establishing the bookstore. Long story, we had to close down the prison part, the activist part, largely due to repression. Josh sent me some FBI files. We didn't even know at the time how active they were, even in closing down that part of what we were doing and how the surveillance was at that point. But we did close that down. But we continued on. When I say we, myself and whoever survived with me, but largely me, we continued on to do the bookstore, build the publishing house, which now is Black Classic Press. And then eventually, 25 years ago, we were able to establish the printing company. That served as a model. We still do a lot of work in the jails with people, but not in the way I envisioned it at the time. However, I will tell you this. The people who were in jail at that time, the longest serving person was Eddie Conway. He served 44 years. I was fortunate enough to work with him in Haymarket. I don't know, we got some Haymarket people in here. Haymarket is doing a book on this in June. That's a plug to their book, okay, our book. Okay, but Eddie Conway was able to come out. He was a consultant during the whole time of building Black Classic Press. He's here in Baltimore. Jack Johnson survived that time. He did 40 years in jail. Those guys and so many other people who came through the prisons were instrumental and fundamental to the establishment of Black Classic Press and also to me selling books and publishing books and being involved with books today.
Okay, yeah, it's just impressive that each person can even condense their own history like that. That's difficult. We have roughly 20 minutes left, and I wanted to raise another very broad question, give you a lot of room to move in either direction. But if for each one of you, if there was just one thing about your history in the book business, book selling, book publishing, what would you want this audience to walk away with? One thing they should know about your history in this business. And we can start from the left again.
I think what's important to remember is the continuum. That bookstores come into being because there is a a reason to come into being. So one of my most important inspirations is Louis Michaud, who Josh mentions in his book as well. And I think he's still been underwritten about and under-recognized. Many of you may know that he opened a bookstore in Harlem. And this would have been in the 20s, correct?
Depression.
And he stocked the bookstore with books that he could get from just, any direction. His brother was a preacher. He was, also, I guess, pretty good with the word. But his bookstore became known as a spot for activism. So not only did he have a place where you could go and read about your history and culture, but then you could also discuss with other people. And in front of his store, he erected these places. I don't know if it was him or the community or both, but it became a place where you could talk. And I don't know, many of you may know about the history of Harlem as this place where people could just go and take a step ladder, stand up at the top of it, and start talking. And you had people, because you think about the immigration of black people from the South at that time was really very constant. And you had people hungry for solutions. Not only what happened to them in the South and why, but what's happening to them in this new kind of urban environment. And the Marcus Garvey movement was, in New York at the time, growing stronger. And eventually, by the time, say, Malcolm came on the scene, it became a very important spot for him he even had an office inside the store. He would speak from there. It was a place where, for example, where do you bring Kwame Nkrumah when he comes to the UN and you want him to speak to people? Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm brought Kwame Nkrumah to a stand in Harlem speaking to people outside, because these are the people that need to talk to Kwame Nkrumah, the president of a newly independent Ghana. So the role of bookstores is fundamental to the community's needs. I'll put it that way. So when he had stuff on his walls talking about, Africa for Africans, what else was the call of the day? He felt very free to say what he believed in on his store. So now at Sankofa, it gives me a little bit of license to do that too. Of course, the inventory is based on our preferences. We come out of the civil rights era, the black nationalism. We come out of a Pan-Africanist era. So the core of our books are going to be books from that era. Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, civil rights book, Hands on the Plow, Patrice Lumumba, just fiction that comes out of the Black arts movement, for example. But then, of course, around that inventory, we're also going to be having books, that are new releases and new authors, et cetera. But our core is from that era because it represents us, and we're very eager to share that with young people because it was written with them in mind. People that are incredibly oppressed write for the next generation. And so a good bookseller makes sure, in my mind, that the next generation gets access to what was left behind for them. We're located right across from Howard University, so it's a bridge that we take full advantage of. But I guess if I were to say, in answer to Josh's question, I want to be a link in a chain. Sankofa, I may not be able to run Sankofa forever. I hope that it's doing some good now, and I hope that the next generation can run it. But if not, it may not be Sankofa. It may be another bookstore. It may be another way of doing what we're doing. But the idea is that literacy, for Black readers is essential. It's always been recognized as essential, always. So you find even on the plantations, people are self-teaching themselves how to read because they know that's a path to liberation. So the quest for literacy and the attempt to make it happen through press, through books selling, through writing, through authorship, whatever means it would take, has always been a part of our existence. And I'm only talking about, in this diaspora. We could go further, talk about other kinds of literacy, but our existence in America has always been one based on literacy. And so I think one thing that, my last point, I guess, about Black bookstores is that the idea is that we have a large job to do. So I don't know any Black bookstore owners that think of their work as competitive with other bookstores, for example. The more bookstores, the better, because you're talking about raising a consciousness of a whole lot of people. And so if your town has, 6 Black bookstores, you've got the opportunity to engage readers more and more and more and more. You can make that town the most, like Harlem. It still is one of the most conscious places in the country. You can walk into Harlem and just, start talking about just about any writer, any author, any historic figure, and people go, yeah, the latest thing about that person. The film that I mentioned earlier, Sankofa, that my husband primarily authored, I co-produced, was about slavery. It took place during slavery, and it was about resistance, and this Black resistance, not being saved by nice white people. And so it had a hard time being distributed, but the Black community really embraced the film. And so when we showed it in Harlem, boom. I don't know how many weeks we stayed in Harlem. We had to self-distribute because distribution companies would not take it. So we stayed in distribution around the country for 2 years because the Black communities were saying, bring it, bring it, bring it, bring it. And we would sit in the audience sometimes, most of the time, sit in the back just to see how people understood the film. Harlem was live. So you have to kind of look at the history of Black bookstore interactions. Did Michaud's bookstore have a role in, helping to create this level of understanding? So our work is cut out for us. There's a lot of work. We can't look at this thing in terms of a pie. It's not a pie. The effort of, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but the reason for Black bookstores is to raise the intellectual conscious engagement of a public as high as possible. So the more the merrier.
Yeah. For me to angle a response to that question is difficult for me because of the audience. Because to me, the relevancy of the history of our bookstore is only really applicable if I could show another person in my circumstance, in my area, how to open a bookstore and be successful at the same time, And let me take it from this. When I was coming in here, I met a brother. He came and said hello to me and stuff, and he told me he's from Florida, from the ghettos in Florida, But he was like, Nati, I came up to your bookstore today, and that is real ghetto. It's like Florida is nothing compared to Baltimore, But the important part in terms of talking about the history that's important to me is this. We've been there as a bookstore for 35 years, And the major activity that you notice in our neighborhood, if you come, that deals with economics or that deals with anything social is, drug use and drug sales, That's our neighborhood. That's the reality of the neighborhood where our bookstore is, But yet still, none of the young brothers or even the older heads come around our bookstore and sell anything, And matter of fact, the older heads be telling the younger heads, make sure you don't go any place by that bookstore. So with all that, they show the importance of a bookstore in the neighborhood as bad as some people might think it is, that the people who you look down on in that neighborhood are the people who probably respect the bookstore the most. So that's the only importance of our history that I can tell you of, you know? Yeah.
I'm just going to do a short story because I think it illustrates, you'll see the point I'm going to make. When I founded the offshoot of Drum and Spear in the HEW building, now HHS building in the government in DC, it was brought there by the black employees. And at some point, I mean, first of all, I started the children's department at section at Drum and Spear. And when we went to Drum and Spear Press, the first children's author we published was Eloise Greenfield. How many people know? Yes, hello. All right. Well, I saw Eloise Greenfield is still a friend. This was her first book, Bubbles. And we did it because I'm sitting up there on the third floor of Drum and Spear Press. And I always say, Jimmy the Rat had the kitchen. I had a big sign that said, go in at your own peril. The heat had been turned off because we had no money. But I get this manuscript from Eloise Greenfield. I know nothing of her at that point because she's never published at that point. And I see this manuscript. I get so excited that I call her 2 days, or it might have been that night. I said, I just saw your manuscript. Okay. It becomes this other book, Bubbles. And now, of course, she has a slew of books. And I hope all of you have the wonderful book that she just recently did on midwives. When the babies drop. Oh, God, it's a gorgeous book. Oh, my goodness. Oh, thank you. When you catch the babies. When they catch the babies? The women, thank you. The women who catch the babies. It's about midwifery. And it's so gorgeous. Okay, so, and then everybody knows Honey, I Live. Okay, well, love. So, I'm now manager at Mama Lazo, and it's in the HEW building, it's in the government building. And the salesman from Scholastic Books comes in, and he shows me a number of books. Well, I had loved a book by Scholastic called Sunflowers for Tina. Okay, so I ask, what about Sunflowers for Tina? And without missing a beat, he says, I didn't know this was a black bookstore. Okay. Now what that said was, and then he goes out and he comes back with his loose leaf of black titles. Okay. Now what that meant was that all of the other bookstores that were not black, were missing out on this gorgeous book. Now, if we still keep saying, okay, black books are for black kids or black people, and Latinx books are for Latinx people, but white books are for everybody, because that's the universal. Then what you do is you deny this wonderful literature. And I'm not just talking about, Zadie Smith, and Whitehead and stuff. I'm not talking about the famous ones. I'm talking about really wonderful books that are not being distributed and out in the bookstores because people assume, only black people will go. Now, again, like Shirikiana, I'm going to get this, said, we know we're talking to the choir, but I hope that folks will understand, these books are for everybody, and they're so wonderful. And particularly for me, my heart is the children's books. And, so that's it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, the one thing is that the question is one thing that I want the audience to know about my history. 44 years of actually publishing and bookselling. I've met great people. Okay, I've met great people, and I want to just acknowledge on this panel, like one of the reasons I was able to come up with that platform of publishing and bookselling was because Drum and Spear existed in Washington, D.C. And I was able to look at the model that they had created for the bookstore and for the publishing house that they had. They didn't have a printing company at the time, but they were able to do those other parts, and that was very, very, very important. The other thing related to that, in terms of great people, I have to look at my people here at PGW, okay? So PGW, just raise your hand. You guys know Publishers Group West. Great people. We've been working together for 20, 25 years. But look, the other people, great people, there are two of them sitting up on this panel. The most modest person in the world is this guy, Nati. And I know y'all were dealing with that Trinidad accent, right? But look, I kid Nati all the time. Because see, you understand there's this book selling world that goes on, the journal world that you guys are familiar with. And then there's this black book selling world. Okay? In the black book selling world, that's the king. Okay? That's the king. All right. And he's not the king, so great people again, right? He's not the king because he's the biggest, the meanest, and all like that, but because he's the most honorable. I was telling someone after you left the room, I couldn't say these things while you were standing there, but after you left the room, I was telling someone, he comes into Black Classic Press on the days that we're broke. Okay, totally broke, trying to figure out how we're going to pay people money. He walks in, and he will walk in the back. He'll select whatever books he's selecting, and he'll leave a check for me. He'll write the books out, and it'll be a blank check. It'll be a blank check. That's the way he does business. The other person is Shirikiana here. If you guys, let me also say, Nati operates the best bookstore, black bookstore, the best stocked black bookstore in the country. Okay? He does that, and he does the distribution. So this is like a center where people come to. The other person is Shirikiana, who talks about getting books from Nati. Shirikiana has continued the legacy, Shirikiana and her husband, who is my kind of friend, okay? Holly Gerima, the filmmaker. But he's continued the legacy in Washington that Drum and Spear, which is so much a part of our history, has done. So I'm really grateful. These people, Shirikiana, Sankofa Books, any given day you'll find people from all over the African diaspora passing through that store. All over the black world will pass through that store. And at any given time, you'll find people delivering presentations and news, information from the black world that keeps us current. So I'm grateful to these folks, and I hope I'm going to close it there. Okay, look, whoever's coming on the tour of the Black Classic Press, I'm going to look forward to seeing you and talking with you more today, okay?
I just asked if we could mention that when we do the book signing, the book that put your hand up. Okay, Betty Garman Robinson I have known Betty, for 60 years now. Okay, so we were in Mississippi together in the national office of SNCC, so we are old buddies from SNCC. We are going to be doing this signing of Hands on the Freedom Plow, personal accounts by women at SNCC. It took us 15 years. Betty and I and 4 other SNCC women were the editors for 15 years. We thought we'd be coming in our walkers to autograph these books. And so, but it's 52 women. And so you'll have Gloria Richardson, the head of the Cambridge, Maryland movement. You'll have Diane Nash. You'll have something on Ella Baker. Lots of photos, lots of stuff. And so that will be there. That's it. Okay. Oh, and one other thing. Again, SNCC 60th. Anybody who wants any information about that, let me know.
I think we have about 4 minutes. So I was just going to try to fit in one brief question, just a brief answer. But we all know that book selling is a tough business. And I'm just curious if you could share briefly one challenge that kind of stands out in your mind that you faced.
Yep. Gentrification. Gentrification. It's a very serious challenge. And I think also, since this panel, I don't want to take up too much, but I think since this panel emerged from this issue of FBI surveillance of black bookstores, we need to be very vigilant about how that manifests now. So we should be clear on what the new FBI looks like and how we try to put how we deal with it. I mean, anytime libraries are asked to give their readers lists, to turn them over, anytime, you read your Kindle or whatever it is, and they tell you, oh, you underline something, they tell you, oh, 40 other people have underlined that same comment. So the information sharing that we're facing now is a real challenge. And I think the FBI is probably, smiling all the way because we're so actively giving this information up. And we're not only asking, we're asking to be surveyed because we're looking for this new technology. We're begging for the latest echo in our house that can listen if we know whether they're listening or not. So that would be my only warning and return to the FBI issue. I don't think we can say that we're free from that surveillance, particularly if we're doing something worthwhile. And we have to be very aware of it. And I want to also just mention that Nati is also a publisher.
I'll second that.
Since I'm not doing the store now, and we're doing a lot of other things, but I just want to give some props to Josh because we do a lot of work with scholars, and certainly as SNCC vets, we oftentimes get a lot of calls about, oh, what was it like? Which is very good because you get the real stuff out there. But a lot of times you don't get scholars who then share their information. And we SNCC folk, we're doing we've been for the last 4 or 5 years doing a website with Duke University, and it's called SNCC Digital, sncc-digital.org. And it's who we were, what we did, and why we did it. But it also has a lot of good information. So it's timelines, it's primary documents. And so we've been able to link to some of that information. But Josh has been really important in sharing the level of FBI involvement. And I think none of us knew. I mean, we really, even though I've gotten my own FOIA requests. I'm sure Betty has. I mean, Betty's been organizing for the last 30 years in Baltimore. But you don't realize the depth of it and just that they were everywhere. So, I mean, that was much appreciated.
I'll just quickly do a second on what Judy's saying about Josh's work and how important it is just in documenting our history. And I'm saying Black book publishing, Black book selling, but I want to extend that. It gives indication because it's not only, your work is not only about Black booksellers, it actually is about head shops and it's about folks who did information from the white community as well. The important thing here is, like, we're up here talking about Black booksellers, there are white booksellers out there. The important thing about Josh's work is that it really connects us all in the sense that you should understand that you're dealing with ideas, you're dealing with information, and we're dealing especially in a time right now that there are people that do not want information available to people. This is an example of the limits that they might go to on one extent, but do not feel so safe to think that those types of activities still do not continue. Everybody in this room is young enough to remember 9/11. And the repression that booksellers, book librarians faced at that point. So Josh's work points and indicates that he's just focusing on head shops, Black, what I would consider to be alternatives at the point. But I think it's a lesson for all of us to learn from and gain from. So thank you for your work, Josh.
Thank you. All of you. I think we're at the end, but I think this was an incredible discussion, and I'm sure some people will be available to talk afterwards. I think some of us are rushing off to the book signing that starts at 12, but it's really wonderful, again, for the ABA to reach out to set this up because I think this history is just beginning to become apparent to a really wide audience, the history of Black bookselling. And it's a huge part of not just the history of bookselling, but it's a major aspect of the history of social movements in the 20th century and today. And so that's what I would leave us with. And so thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panelists for a really incredible discussion.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!